No one imagined what George Strait would do with the president's gift, the story that made America cry. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Cedar Creek, Texas, as Roberto Silva adjusted his prosthetic leg and stared at the empty storefront that would either make or break his dreams. The weathered veteran ran his calloused fingers along the keys to what would become Veterans Music Corner, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded him of his first day in Afghanistan. After 3 years of saving every penny from his disability checks and working double shifts at the local auto parts store, this 50-year-old former sergeant was about to bet everything on a dream that had kept him alive through the darkest moments of his recovery. Roberto's weathered hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. The metallic click echoed through the empty space, a sound that seemed to announce the beginning of something monumental. As he pushed open the door, the musty smell of old wood and forgotten dreams filled his nostrils. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like tiny spirits of possibility. This wasn't just a store opening tomorrow. This was his chance to prove that losing his left leg below the knee in an IED explosion hadn't stolen his ability to build something meaningful with his remaining years. The irony wasn't lost on him that music had saved his life twice. First, during those endless nights in the field hospital in Kandahar, when the nurses would play George Strait's greatest hits to help wounded soldiers sleep through their pain. Later, during the brutal months of physical therapy back home in Texas, when he discovered that tinkering with broken guitars gave his hands something to do besides shake with phantom pain from his missing limb. Now, surrounded by the tools of his new trade, Roberto allowed himself a moment to imagine the conversations he would have with fellow veterans who needed their instruments repaired, the stories they would share, the healing that might happen within these 4 walls. The bell above the door chimed as his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, peeked inside, her gray hair tied back in the same bun she had worn for the 20 years Roberto had known her. "Roberto, honey, are you really opening tomorrow?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular blend of hope and concern that only a woman who had buried 2 sons in foreign wars could master. "I've been telling everyone at church about your little shop. We're all so proud of you, sweetheart. Before you continue with this incredible journey of courage and determination, we would love to have you join our community. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what you think about Roberto's brave decision to follow his dreams despite everything he's been through. Tell us where you're watching from, because stories like these remind us that the American spirit lives strong in every corner of our great nation." Roberto smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in weeks. "Yes, ma'am. Tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, I'll be ready for business." He gestured toward the workbench where several guitars in various stages of repair waited for his attention. "I've got enough work lined up to keep me busy for months. Turns out there are a lot of musicians in this county who need someone who understands that every instrument has a story worth preserving." Mrs. Henderson stepped inside, her eyes scanning the carefully organized space with obvious approval. "Your daddy would be so proud," she whispered, reaching out to touch a vintage Gibson that hung on the wall. "I remember when you were just a little boy, always taking apart radios and putting them back together. Even then, we knew you had special hands." The mention of his father sent a familiar ache through Roberto's chest. Master Sergeant Miguel Silva had died in a training accident when Roberto was just 15, but not before teaching his son that a man's worth wasn't measured by what life took from him, but by what he chose to build with what remained. Standing in this shop, surrounded by instruments that other people had given up on, Roberto felt his father's presence as strongly as the Texas heat that was already building outside, despite the early hour. "Mrs. Henderson, would you like to be my first official customer?" Roberto asked, pulling a beautifully restored mandolin from behind the counter. "This belonged to old Mr. Peterson's grandfather. He brought it to me 3 months ago, said it hadn't played a note in 30 years. Told me if I could bring it back to life, he'd pay me double what I asked." The elderly woman's eyes widened as Roberto carefully placed the instrument in her hands. With surprising grace, she positioned her fingers on the frets and strummed a chord that rang clear and true through the small space. The sound seemed to chase away years of silence, filling the shop with music that spoke of generations past and hope for those yet to come. "Oh, Roberto," she breathed, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. "It's beautiful. It sounds just like it did when I was a girl, and Mr. Peterson's grandfather used to play at the church socials." She strummed another chord, this one with more confidence. "How much does he owe you for this miracle?" Roberto waved his hand dismissively. "Mr. Peterson already paid me, but I'm not talking about money. Would you do me the honor of playing the first song in my new shop? I think music should christen this place properly." As Mrs. Henderson began to play a gentle melody that seemed to rise from the deepest wells of Texas tradition, Roberto felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about repairing instruments anymore. This was about healing, about bringing broken things back to life, about proving that damage didn't have to mean the end of usefulness. Every scratch on every guitar, every dented horn, every piano with missing keys that would come through his door represented someone's interrupted dream, someone's silenced voice that deserved to sing again. The morning passed quickly as word spread through the small community that Roberto's shop would officially open the next day. Fellow veterans stopped by to wish him luck, many carrying instruments that had been neglected too long. Each visitor brought their own story of loss and hope, creating a tapestry of shared experience that transformed the simple commercial space into something approaching sacred ground. By noon, the Texas sun was beating down mercilessly, and Roberto was grateful for the air conditioning unit that wheezed and rattled but managed to keep the interior tolerable. He was adjusting the tension on a guitar neck when the rumble of distant thunder caught his attention. Looking through the front window, he could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon with the kind of ominous speed that every Texan learned to respect. "Storm's coming," observed Jake Mitchell, a Navy veteran who had stopped by to ask about having his saxophone repaired. "Radio said we might get some heavy rain tonight. You got everything battened down good?" Roberto nodded, though he felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. "Insurance is all paid up, and I moved the most valuable pieces away from the windows. Should be fine." But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that the careful balance he had built between hope and pragmatism was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. The first drops of rain began to fall just as Jake was leaving, each droplet striking the sidewalk with increasing frequency until the gentle patter became a steady drumbeat against the shop's roof. Roberto stood at the window, watching the sky darken with an intensity that seemed to promise more than just an afternoon shower. In the distance, lightning flickered like a celestial photographer's flash, illuminating the approaching storm clouds with brief, brilliant clarity. As the afternoon wore on, the rain grew heavier, and Roberto found himself constantly glancing toward the windows, watching as the gutters began to overflow, and the streets started to flood with alarming speed. The weather radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates about flash flood warnings and the possibility of tornadoes forming in the surrounding counties. By evening, what had started as a manageable rainstorm had transformed into something far more dangerous. Roberto stood inside his shop, watching in growing horror as water began to seep under the front door, carrying with it the dreams and hopes he had spent 3 years building. The irony was cruel beyond measure. After surviving bombs and bullets in a foreign desert, his American dream was being destroyed by the very Texas rain that was supposed to nourish new beginnings. As the water continued to rise, Roberto realized that tomorrow's grand opening would have to wait. The question was no longer whether his shop would succeed, but whether anything would be left to salvage from the wreckage of his dreams. Dawn broke gray and merciless over Cedar Creek, revealing the full extent of the devastation that had torn through Roberto Silva's life in a single night. Where yesterday had stood a meticulously organized music repair shop filled with hope and possibility, now remained only a waterlogged tomb of broken dreams. Roberto stood knee-deep in muddy water that had receded just enough to reveal the scope of his losses, his prosthetic leg making each step through the debris a careful negotiation between determination and despair. The vintage Gibson that had hung proudly on the wall now floated face down near the back corner, its beautiful wood finish ruined beyond any hope of restoration. Mrs. Henderson's mandolin, the instrument that had played the first song in his shop just 24 hours earlier, lay buried under a pile of soggy sheet music and twisted metal tubing from his display racks. Every guitar, every violin, every harmonica that customers had entrusted to his care was either destroyed completely or damaged beyond his ability to repair. Roberto's hands shook as he lifted a photograph from the murky water, the image of his father in military dress, now nothing more than a blur of dissolved ink and waterlogged paper. This wasn't just financial ruin. This was the erasure of everything he had built to honor his father's memory, and his own service to his country. The insurance adjuster wouldn't arrive until Monday, but Roberto didn't need an expert to tell him that his policy's flood coverage was minimal at best. Like most small business owners in Texas, he had gambled that the extra premium wasn't worth the risk. The bell that had chimed so cheerfully yesterday now hung silent and twisted, a metallic witness to the cruelty of timing. Roberto sank onto an overturned workbench, his artificial leg creating small ripples in the standing water, as he contemplated the mathematics of his situation. 3 years of savings, wiped out. 6 months of advance inventory, destroyed. The grand opening that was supposed to happen in 3 hours, cancelled indefinitely. Worse than the financial catastrophe was the realization that he was 50 years old, disabled, and starting completely over with nothing but debt and disappointment. The sound of voices outside drew his attention to the street, where neighbors were beginning to assess their own damages. The entire commercial district had been hit hard, but Roberto's shop, located in the lowest part of the block, had taken the worst of it. Through the cracked front window, he could see Mrs. Henderson picking through the remnants of her garden, her face set in the kind of determined resignation that came from surviving decades of Texas weather. "Roberto, honey, you okay in there?" Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much loss to waste time on false comfort. When he didn't answer immediately, she waded through the ankle-deep water that still covered the sidewalk and peered through his doorway. The sharp intake of breath that escaped her lips said everything that words couldn't express. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson," Roberto said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you were looking forward to the opening. I know everyone was." The elderly woman stepped carefully into the ruined shop, her eyes taking in the devastation with the practical assessment of someone who had lived through the Dust Bowl stories her grandmother had told her. "Roberto Silva, you listen to me right now," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children through good times and bad. "This is not your fault, and this is not the end of your story." But Roberto couldn't hear hope in her words. All he could see was the ruin surrounding him, the weight of expectations from his community, and the crushing reality that his disability pension wouldn't be enough to start over. The monthly payments that had seemed adequate when he lived simply were laughably insufficient for rebuilding a business from scratch. He needed capital, and he needed it fast, before his competitors absorbed the customers who had been planning to visit his shop. By 10 in the morning, after Mrs. Henderson had reluctantly left to deal with her own storm damage, Roberto had made his decision. He would swallow his pride and visit First National Bank of Cedar Creek, where he had maintained his checking account for the past 5 years. Surely, as a veteran with a business plan and a track record of responsible financial management, he could secure a small business loan to get back on his feet. The thought of begging for money made his stomach turn, but the alternative was admitting defeat and disappointing everyone who had believed in him. Roberto changed into his best suit, the same navy blue outfit he had worn to his father's funeral 15 years earlier. The fabric smelled faintly of mothballs and memories, but it was the most professional outfit he owned. He practiced his pitch during the drive to the bank, rehearsing the words that would convince a loan officer that a disabled veteran with a destroyed business was a good investment risk. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was more nervous about this conversation than he had been about defusing roadside bombs in Afghanistan. First National Bank of Cedar Creek occupied a corner building that had survived every economic downturn since 1928, its red brick facade projecting the kind of institutional stability that small communities depended on during uncertain times. Roberto had always felt a sense of security when conducting his modest banking business there, but today the building seemed to loom over him like a fortress designed to keep out the desperate and the damaged. The lobby was nearly empty when Roberto entered, his prosthetic leg clicking softly against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to announce his disability to everyone within earshot. Behind the customer service desk sat 3 tellers who had known him by name for years, but today their smiles seemed forced and their greetings overly cheerful in the way that people talked to children and invalids. "I'd like to speak with someone about a business loan," Roberto told the receptionist, a young woman whose nameplate identified her as Jessica. She couldn't have been more than 25, and Roberto wondered if she had ever seen real hardship or if bank loans were just numbers on a computer screen to her. "Of course, Mr. Silva. Let me see if Mr. Brennan is available." Jessica's fingers clicked across her keyboard, with the efficiency of someone who had never doubted that the system would work in her favor. He should be free in just a few minutes. The wait felt eternal. Roberto sat in a leather chair that was too low for his prosthetic leg, forcing him to adjust his position every few minutes to maintain circulation. Around him, other customers conducted their business with the casual confidence of people whose lives hadn't been destroyed by a single night of rain. A young couple discussed mortgage rates for their first home. An elderly farmer deposited what looked like a substantial check. Everyone seemed to belong in this world of financial stability, except Roberto. "Mr. Silva, Mr. Brennan will see you now." Jessica's voice startled him from his brooding. She led him down a hallway lined with photographs of the bank's founding families, past offices where other loan officers discussed other people's dreams and disappointments, to a corner office where Thomas Brennan waited behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of Texas oak. Brennan was younger than Roberto had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of soft hands and pale complexion that suggested a life spent entirely indoors. His suit was expensive, his haircut precise, and his smile had the calculated warmth of someone who had learned to project success rather than earn it. On his desk sat photographs of a wife and 2 children who looked like they had stepped out of a catalogue advertising the American dream. "Please have a seat, Mr. Silva. I understand you're interested in discussing a business loan." Brennan's tone was professional but guarded, the voice of someone who had already decided the outcome of their conversation before it began. "I should mention that we heard about the flooding in your area. I hope you didn't suffer too much damage." Roberto launched into his prepared speech, explaining his business plan, his experience with musical instrument repair, the market demand he had identified in the community. He talked about his military service, his disability pension, his 5 years of perfect banking history with the institution. He presented his insurance information, his customer list, his projected revenue figures based on the work orders he had already received. Brennan listened with the patience of someone who was paid to let desperate people exhaust themselves with explanations. He asked a few questions about Roberto's collateral, his other sources of income, his plans for repayment. His fingers drummed silently on the desk as Roberto spoke, a rhythmic tapping that suggested boredom rather than consideration. "Mr. Silva," Brennan said finally, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual authority that comes from holding other people's hopes in your hands, "I appreciate you coming in today, and I certainly sympathize with your situation. However, I have to be honest with you about the realities of small business lending in the current economic climate." The words that followed felt like physical blows. Insufficient collateral, high-risk demographic, limited revenue history, uncertain market conditions. Brennan delivered each objection with the detached professionalism of a doctor discussing a terminal diagnosis, never quite saying no but making it clear that yes was impossible. "Furthermore," Brennan continued, his voice taking on a tone that Roberto would remember for the rest of his life, "I have to question whether someone in your condition should really be taking on the stress and physical demands of running a small business. Perhaps it would be wiser to consider more realistic options for someone with your limitations." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the air conditioning and the distant sound of normal people conducting normal business in the lobby. Roberto felt the blood drain from his face as the full impact of Brennan's words settled into his consciousness. He wasn't just being denied a loan, he was being told that his disability made him unfit to pursue his dreams. "My limitations," Roberto's voice was barely controlled, the same tone he had used when addressing subordinates who had put their unit in danger through carelessness or cowardice. "Mr. Brennan, I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I lost my leg defusing a bomb that would have killed 6 of my fellow soldiers. What exactly do you think I'm not capable of handling?" Brennan's expression didn't change, but something cold and ugly flickered behind his eyes. "Mr. Silva, I'm not questioning your service to our country, and I certainly respect the sacrifices you've made. But banking is about risk assessment, and I have to consider all factors when evaluating loan applications. The statistics on disabled entrepreneurs are not encouraging, especially in specialty retail markets." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Roberto barely heard the words. All he could focus on was the way Brennan's gaze kept dropping to his prosthetic leg, the way the loan officer's voice carried the patronizing tone that Roberto had learned to recognize from doctors and bureaucrats who saw his disability before they saw his humanity. When Brennan finally stood to signal the end of their meeting, Roberto realized that he had been naive to think that his service to his country would matter more than his physical limitations. As Roberto walked through the lobby toward the exit, he could feel the eyes of other customers following his progress. An elderly couple whispered to each other near the information desk. A businessman in an expensive suit looked up from his phone long enough to register Roberto's prosthetic leg with the kind of uncomfortable stare that disabled people learn to endure. Even Jessica, the young receptionist, watched him leave with a mixture of pity and relief that his disappointment was no longer her problem to witness. The automatic doors of the bank seemed to hiss with derision as Roberto stepped back into the Texas heat, his suit already beginning to stick to his skin in the humidity that followed the previous night's storm. Behind him, the business of the bank continued without pause, other people's dreams being approved or denied with the same casual efficiency that had just destroyed his own hopes for rebuilding. Roberto sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine, staring at the bank's red brick facade and wondering if this was how his story was meant to end. A disabled veteran whose sacrifice had earned him nothing but condescension from people who had never risked anything more dangerous than a bad investment. The American dream, it seemed, came with terms and conditions that nobody had bothered to explain to him when he was 19 years old and eager to serve his country. As he drove away from the bank, Roberto didn't notice the black SUV with government plates that had been parked across the street, or the man inside who had been watching the entire exchange through the bank's large windows. He didn't know that his humiliation had been witnessed by someone who had the power to change everything, someone who understood the true value of a soldier's sacrifice and wouldn't stand by while that sacrifice was mocked by small-minded bureaucrats. The wheels of justice, like the wheels of Roberto's truck, were beginning to turn, but he wouldn't understand the significance of this moment until much later, when a country music legend would walk into his life and prove that sometimes the most powerful people in America are the ones who remember where they came from. 300 miles away in San Antonio, George Strait was finishing his morning coffee while reading reports about the devastating floods that had swept through central Texas. The king of country sat in his modest kitchen, the same one where he and Norma had shared breakfast for nearly 5 decades, scanning the newspaper with the careful attention of a man who understood that behind every disaster statistic was a human story worth knowing. At 71 years old, George had seen enough of life to know that real tragedy often happened quietly, in the spaces between headlines where ordinary people's dreams got washed away without making the evening news. Norma entered the kitchen carrying her own cup of coffee, her silver hair catching the morning light as she settled into the chair across from her husband. Even after all these years, George still felt his heart skip a beat when she smiled at him, the same reaction he'd had when they were teenagers growing up in the same small Texas town. The flooding was worse than they initially reported, she said, glancing at the newspaper spread across their kitchen table. Channel 5 said some of those small communities might take years to recover completely. George nodded grimly, remembering his own family's struggles during the economic downturns of his youth, when his father had worked multiple jobs to keep their ranch afloat and their family fed. Success had never made him forget the precarious nature of the American dream, especially for ordinary folks who didn't have the luxury of multiple revenue streams or celebrity status to fall back on when disaster struck. "Makes you appreciate what we have," he said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze Norma's hand. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive ring of George's cell phone, a sound that typically meant business rather than pleasure at this hour of the morning. The caller ID showed his longtime friend and occasional tour manager, Danny Martinez, who rarely called unless something important was happening that required George's immediate attention or input about scheduling conflicts. "George, I hope I'm not calling too early." Danny's voice carried the urgent undertone that suggested this wasn't a routine check-in about upcoming performances or recording sessions. "I'm in Cedar Creek right now, helping my cousin assess damage from last night's flooding. There's something here I think you need to know about. Something that's going to make you madder than hell." George had known Danny for over 20 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he had heard this level of controlled anger in his friend's voice. Danny was the kind of man who had seen enough of the music business to remain calm under pressure, but something about his tone suggested that this situation was different more personal than professional considerations. "What's going on, Danny?" George asked, putting the phone on speaker so Norma could hear the conversation. In their marriage, they had learned that transparency was the foundation of every important decision, especially when those decisions might affect other people's lives in significant ways. "There's a veteran here, a guy named Roberto Silva. Lost his leg in Afghanistan, came home and spent 3 years building a music repair business. Yesterday was supposed to be his grand opening. The flood wiped him out completely, George. Every instrument, every tool, every piece of inventory. Gone." Danny's voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the destruction firsthand and understood its implications for Roberto's future. George felt his jaw tighten with familiar frustration. Too many of his friends were veterans, and he had heard variations of this story more times than he cared to count. Good men and women who had sacrificed for their country only to come home and struggle with a system that seemed designed to forget their service the moment they needed help the most. "That's terrible, Danny. But why are you calling me about it specifically?" George asked, though he suspected he already knew where the conversation was headed. His friend wasn't the type to call just to share bad news without having a reason for involving George in the situation. "Because this morning, this Roberto went to First National Bank here in Cedar Creek to apply for an emergency business loan. The loan officer, some punk named Thomas Brennan, didn't just turn him down. He told this veteran that maybe disabled people shouldn't be trying to run businesses. Said the statistics on disabled entrepreneurs weren't encouraging. I watched the whole thing through the window, George. This hero who lost his leg serving our country got lectured about his limitations by some banker who's never done anything more dangerous than approve a car loan. The silence that followed was filled with the kind of cold anger that George Strait rarely displayed, but never forgot. Norma could see the muscles in his jaw working as he processed what Danny had just told him, and she recognized the expression that meant her husband was about to do something that would make a difference in someone's life, regardless of the cost or complexity involved. "You still there, George?" Danny's voice carried a note of concern, as if he worried that the connection had been lost, or that he had overstepped by bringing this situation to George's attention during what was supposed to be a quiet morning at home. "I'm here," George said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that anyone who knew him well recognized as a prelude to action. "Danny, I want you to find out everything you can about this Roberto Silva, his service record, his business plan, his family situation, and I want to know more about this banker who thinks he can talk to veterans like they're second-class citizens." Norma leaned forward, her eyes meeting her husband's across the table, with the kind of silent communication that comes from decades of shared values and mutual respect. "George, are you thinking about the presidential gift?" she asked quietly, referring to the mysterious envelope that had been delivered to them just days earlier during the ceremony at the White House. The envelope. George had almost forgotten about the unprecedented gift that the president had bestowed upon him during what was supposed to be a routine recognition ceremony for his contributions to American culture. $5 million of discretionary federal funding that he could direct toward any cause of his choosing. No bureaucracy, no oversight, no political considerations, just a direct line to making a difference in people's lives based on his own judgment about what was right and necessary. "What presidential gift?" Danny's voice carried the curiosity of someone who knew that George and Norma didn't typically keep secrets from their close friends, especially when those secrets involved unusual opportunities or resources that might be relevant to situations like Roberto's. George looked at Norma, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They had discussed the unusual nature of the president's gift extensively over the past few days, weighing the responsibility that came with such unprecedented access to federal resources. Neither of them had taken the decision lightly, but both had agreed that the right situation would present itself when the time was appropriate for action. "Danny, I need you to keep this between us for now, but the president gave me access to a special federal fund, $5 million that I can use however I see fit to help Americans who deserve better than what they're getting from the system. I think we just found our first recipient." The line went quiet for several seconds before Danny's voice returned, filled with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "George, are you serious? You're talking about helping this veteran rebuild his business with federal money. Just like that?" "Not just like that," George corrected, his mind already working through the logistics of what would need to happen to make this work effectively and efficiently. "We're going to do this right, Danny. We're going to help Roberto Silva rebuild his business better than it was before, and we're going to make sure that banker understands that disrespecting veterans has consequences. But first, I need to meet this Roberto myself." Norma smiled with the pride that came from being married to a man whose success had never diminished his commitment to doing what was right rather than what was easy or convenient. "When do we leave for Cedar Creek?" she asked, already knowing that they would be making the trip together, as they had made every important journey in their lives together. "This afternoon," George said, his decision made with the certainty that came from knowing his own values and trusting his instincts about when action was required. "Danny, can you arrange for us to meet Roberto without making a big production out of it? I don't want media attention or crowds. Just a conversation between one Texan and another." "I can do that," Danny replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had hoped for exactly this kind of response when he made the call. "George, you should know that Roberto doesn't have any idea who was watching when he got humiliated at the bank this morning. He's probably at home right now, thinking his dreams are over." George felt something tighten in his chest, remembering his own early struggles in the music business when rejection and disappointment had seemed like permanent fixtures in his life. The difference was that he had never been wounded in service to his country, never sacrificed his body for the freedom that allowed ungrateful bankers to prosper in safety and comfort. "Well, then I guess it's time to show him that sometimes dreams get delayed, not destroyed," George said, already reaching for his truck keys. "Danny, find out what Roberto's favorite meal is. Norma and I are going to take him and his family to dinner tonight, and we're going to talk about the future instead of dwelling on yesterday's disappointments." As George ended the call, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven him throughout his career, the same instinct that had guided him towards songs that mattered and away from empty commercial success. This wasn't about publicity or tax write-offs or feeling good about charitable giving. This was about honoring the sacrifice of men like Roberto Silva by proving that their service still mattered to someone with the power to make a difference. Norma stood and walked around the table to embrace her husband, feeling the tension in his shoulders that always appeared when he was preparing to take on a challenge that mattered more than money or fame. "You know, this is going to be complicated," she said softly. "Once word gets out about what you're doing, every veteran in America is going to have a story that breaks your heart." "Then maybe it's time to break some hearts," George replied, holding his wife close and breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. "Maybe it's time to remind people that this country was built by folks who understood that taking care of each other isn't charity, it's responsibility." Outside their kitchen window, the Texas afternoon stretched endlessly toward the horizon, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when they woke up that morning. Somewhere in Cedar Creek, a disabled veteran was probably sitting in his ruined shop, wondering if he would ever get another chance to prove himself worthy of the American dream. In a few hours, Roberto Silva would discover that sometimes the most important phone calls come from numbers you don't recognize, and sometimes the cavalry arrives in the form of a country music legend who remembers that real strength is measured not by what you can take, but by what you're willing to give. The drive to Cedar Creek would take just under 4 hours, enough time for George and Norma to plan an approach that would preserve Roberto's dignity while providing him with the resources he needed to rebuild bigger and better than before. But first, they had a banker to visit because some lessons about respect and humility couldn't wait until business hours the next day. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the Texas horizon when George Strait's black pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of First National Bank of Cedar Creek. Through the large windows of the lobby, he could see the same scene that Roberto Silva had witnessed just hours earlier. Well-dressed customers conducting their business with the casual confidence of people whose lives had never been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. What those customers couldn't see was the controlled fury burning behind the calm exterior of the man who was about to walk through their doors. Norma squeezed her husband's hand as they sat in the truck for a moment, both of them preparing for a confrontation that would either teach an important lesson about respect or create a public relations nightmare that would follow them for years. "You remember what we talked about on the drive?" she said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of a woman who had watched her husband navigate 40 years of success without losing his essential decency. "We're here to educate, not humiliate." "I remember," George replied, though his voice carried an edge that suggested his commitment to diplomacy had limits that were rapidly approaching. But some people need stronger lessons than others, and I have a feeling Thomas Brennan is one of them. They entered the bank together, their presence immediately drawing the attention of every person in the lobby. George Strait's face was recognizable to anyone who had lived in Texas for more than 5 minutes, but his expression today carried none of the warmth that fans had come to expect from his public appearances. This was not the affable country star who signed autographs and posed for photographs. This was a man on a mission that had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with justice. "Excuse me," George said to Jessica, the young receptionist who had processed Roberto's humiliation earlier that morning. "I'd like to speak with Thomas Brennan. It's about Roberto Silva." Jessica's eyes widened as she processed the surreal experience of having George Strait request a meeting in her small-town bank. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the phone to call Brennan's office, and her voice cracked when she announced that there was a visitor who wanted to discuss the Silva account. The wait was brief. Thomas Brennan emerged from his office with the eager expression of someone who assumed that George Strait's presence meant an opportunity for a high-profile banking relationship that would enhance his career prospects. His expensive suit and calculated smile projected the same arrogant confidence that had characterized his treatment of Roberto, though his demeanor suggested he expected this conversation to go very differently. "Mr. Strait, this is such an honor," Brennan said, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had already begun planning how he would describe this encounter to his colleagues and superiors. "I had no idea you were familiar with our little bank. How can we help you today?" George accepted the handshake, but held Brennan's gaze with an intensity that immediately altered the banker's expression from eager anticipation to growing concern. "We can start with you explaining how you treated Roberto Silva this morning," George said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to command attention. The color drained from Brennan's face as he realized that this was not the friendly celebrity encounter he had anticipated. Around the lobby, other customers began to take notice of the conversation, sensing the tension that was building between the famous country singer and the increasingly uncomfortable bank official. "I'm not sure what you mean," Brennan stammered, though his eyes betrayed the knowledge that his earlier conversation with Roberto had somehow reached the attention of one of the most respected figures in American music. "All loan decisions are based on standard banking criteria and risk assessment protocols." "Risk assessment," George repeated, his tone making it clear that he found the phrase particularly offensive in this context. "Mr. Brennan, let me tell you about risk assessment. Roberto Silva risked his life for 3 tours in Afghanistan while you were sitting safely behind this desk. He risked his leg defusing a bomb that would have killed 6 American soldiers. What exactly have you risked for your country?" The lobby had grown quiet, with customers and employees alike sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Norma stood slightly behind her husband, her presence providing the support he needed, while ensuring that this confrontation remained focused on the principles at stake rather than personal animosity. Brennan's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "Mr. Strait, I understand you may have strong feelings about veterans' issues, but banking regulations require us to evaluate all applicants according to the same standards. I was simply doing my job." "Your job," George said, his voice rising slightly for the first time since entering the bank, "is to serve the community that trusts you with their financial future. Your job is to recognize that a man who lost his leg serving this country deserves better than being lectured about his limitations by someone who wouldn't last 5 minutes in his boots." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Every person in the lobby understood that they were witnessing more than a disagreement about banking policies. They were seeing a fundamental clash between 2 different visions of what America owed its veterans. "Furthermore," George continued, reaching into his jacket pocket to retrieve a document that would change everything, "I want you to understand exactly who you were talking to this morning. Roberto Silva didn't just lose his leg in Afghanistan. He received the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for his service. He saved the lives of 6 fellow soldiers and spent 14 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again. And when he came home, instead of feeling sorry for himself, he used his skills and his passion for music to build something that would serve his community." Brennan's expression had shifted from confusion to dawning horror as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just about a loan denial. This was about his failure to recognize and respect the sacrifice of a genuine American hero. "Mr. Brennan," Norma spoke for the first time since entering the bank, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a woman who had spent decades watching her husband use his influence responsibly. "My husband received a very special gift from the President of the United States. A gift that allows him to direct federal funding toward causes that matter to American communities. We've decided that Roberto Silva's business will be our first recipient." George pulled out the official document that bore the presidential seal, holding it so that Brennan and several nearby customers could see the government letterhead and formal language that granted him unprecedented access to federal resources. $5 million, he said quietly, "to be used at my discretion for supporting American veterans who deserve better than what they've been getting from their local institutions." The banker's face had gone completely pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as the implications of the situation became clear. This wasn't just about losing a potential customer. This was about having his treatment of a veteran exposed by someone with the power to make his professional life very difficult. "But that's not all we're going to do," George continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had saved the best part for last. "We're also going to make sure that every veteran in this community knows about Roberto's new business and about the kind of treatment they can expect if they need banking services. Word has a way of traveling fast in small towns, Mr. Brennan, especially when that word involves how local institutions treat the men and women who fought for our freedom." Several customers in the lobby had begun to nod in approval, and George could see that his message was resonating with people who understood the values he was defending. These were the kind of Texans who appreciated straight talk and respected those who stood up for what was right regardless of the potential consequences. "Mr. Strait," Brennan said desperately, his professional composure completely abandoned as he realized that his career might not survive this encounter. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding about my conversation with Mr. Silva. Perhaps we could reconsider his loan application under different criteria." "Oh, there was no misunderstanding," George replied, his tone carrying the finality of someone who had made his decision and would not be swayed by last-minute attempts at damage control. "You showed your true character this morning when you thought nobody important was watching. The problem is that somebody was watching, and now the whole community is going to know exactly what kind of man you really are." George turned to address the other customers who had gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation. "Folks, I want you to meet my wife Norma," he said, his voice resuming the warmth that had made him beloved by generations of country music fans. "We're here because we believe that veterans like Roberto Silva deserve better than what they got in this bank today, and we're going to make sure he gets it." The applause that followed was spontaneous and genuine, coming from people who understood that they had witnessed something rare, a celebrity using his influence, not for personal gain, but to defend someone who couldn't defend himself against institutional indifference and prejudice. As George and Norma prepared to leave the bank, Brennan made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Strait, please, perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can reach some kind of understanding." George paused at the door, looking back at the banker with an expression that combined disappointment with determination. "Mr. Brennan, the only understanding we need to reach is this. Roberto Silva is going to rebuild his business bigger and better than before, and it's going to happen without any help from you or this institution. And every time someone in this community needs a loan, they're going to remember how you treated a man who lost his leg serving their country." The automatic doors closed behind them with a soft whoosh, leaving Thomas Brennan standing in his lobby, surrounded by customers whose expressions ranged from admiration for George Strait to disgust at their banker's behavior. The afternoon sun seemed brighter as George and Norma walked toward their truck, knowing that they had struck the first blow in a campaign that would transform Roberto Silva's life and send a message about respect and dignity that would resonate far beyond the borders of Cedar Creek. "That felt good," Norma said as they settled into their truck, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched justice unfold in real time. "But now comes the really important part." "Finding Roberto," George agreed, starting the engine and pulling out of the bank's parking lot. "Danny said he's probably at home, thinking his dreams are over. Time to show him that sometimes dreams just need better financing and more determined friends." As they drove toward Roberto Silva's address, neither of them noticed the small crowd that had gathered outside the bank, or the way several customers were already pulling out their phones to call friends and family about what they had just witnessed. By evening, the story would be spreading through Cedar Creek like wildfire, and by morning, it would be impossible for anyone in the community to claim they didn't know about the country music legend who had stood up for a veteran against a banker who forgot his place in the American hierarchy of respect and honor. Roberto Silva was sitting on his front porch, staring at the insurance paperwork that confirmed his worst fears, when a black pickup truck pulled into his driveway. The afternoon heat had driven most of his neighbors indoors, leaving the usually bustling residential street unusually quiet except for the distant sound of children playing in backyards and the occasional bark of a dog seeking attention from its absent owners. Roberto barely looked up from the documents that spelled out in clinical terms exactly how insufficient his coverage was for rebuilding his dreams from the ground up. The truck's doors opened simultaneously, and Roberto found himself watching in disbelief as George Strait and a woman who could only be his wife Norma approached his modest front steps. For a moment, Roberto wondered if the stress of the past 24 hours had finally caused him to lose his grip on reality, because there was no logical explanation for the king of country music to be walking across his front yard, carrying what appeared to be a folder full of official documents. "Roberto Silva?" George asked, his voice carrying the same genuine warmth that had made him beloved by millions of fans, but today there was something else in his tone, a quality that suggested this visit was about much more than celebrity charity or feel-good publicity. "I'm George Strait, and this is my wife Norma. We'd like to talk with you if you have a few minutes." Roberto struggled to his feet, his prosthetic leg making the movement awkward as he tried to process the surreal nature of the situation. "Mr. Strait, Yes, sir, of course. Please, come up and have a seat." He gestured toward the 2 additional chairs on his porch, furniture that his late father had built by hand and that Roberto had managed to save from the flood that destroyed everything else. Norma smiled with the grace of a woman who had spent decades putting nervous people at ease during unexpected encounters. "Roberto, we heard about what happened to your shop and about your visit to the bank this morning. We're here because we think you deserve better than what you received from both situations." The directness of her statement left Roberto momentarily speechless. He had spent the entire afternoon wondering how the news of his humiliation at the bank could have spread so quickly through such a small community, but he never could have imagined that it would reach the attention of someone like George Strait within a matter of hours. "I don't understand," Roberto said finally, settling back into his chair and trying to make sense of this unprecedented turn of events. Why would you? I'm just a guy from Cedar Creek who had some bad luck with the weather, and a banker who doesn't think much of disabled veterans." George leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming serious in a way that commanded Roberto's complete attention. "Roberto, first thing you need to understand is that you're not just some guy. You're a Purple Heart recipient who lost his leg serving our country in Afghanistan. You're a Bronze Star winner who saved the lives of 6 fellow soldiers. You're a small business owner who spent 3 years building something that would serve his community. That makes you exactly the kind of American that this country was built to support and protect." The words hit Roberto with unexpected force, bringing tears to his eyes as he realized that someone had taken the time to learn about his service record and understand the significance of his sacrifice. For too long he had felt invisible, just another disabled veteran struggling to find his place in a civilian world that seemed to have forgotten the cost of its freedom. "More importantly," Norma added gently, "you're someone who never asked for handouts or special treatment. You just wanted the same opportunity that any other citizen would expect when they walked into that bank with a solid business plan and a good reputation. The fact that Thomas Brennan couldn't see your worth says everything about his character and nothing about yours." George reached into the folder he'd been carrying and pulled out several documents that bore official government seals and presidential letterheads. "Roberto, I want to show you something that's going to change your life, but first I need you to understand that this isn't charity. This is recognition. This is America keeping its promise to the men and women who kept their promise to America." Roberto's hands shook slightly as he accepted the documents, his eyes scanning the formal language that seemed to suggest resources and possibilities beyond anything he had dared to imagine. The presidential seal at the top of the first page made it clear that this was no ordinary business proposition or celebrity publicity stunt. "The President of the United States gave me access to $5 million in federal funding," George explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the magnitude of the responsibility he had been given. "Money that I can direct toward any cause, I believe serves the American people. Roberto, you and your business are going to be our first recipients." The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of Roberto's breathing, as he tried to process the implications of what he was being told. This wasn't just about rebuilding his shop. This was about being chosen by the President of the United States, through George Strait, as worthy of federal investment in his dreams and capabilities. "I don't know what to say," Roberto whispered, his voice barely audible as emotions overwhelmed his ability to speak coherently. "This morning I thought my life was over. I thought I had failed at the one thing I was good at besides being a soldier." "Roberto," George said firmly, "you didn't fail at anything. A natural disaster destroyed your building, not your skills or your character or your potential, and a small-minded banker revealed his own limitations, not yours. What we're going to do now is rebuild your business bigger and better than it was before, and we're going to make sure the whole community knows that veterans like you represent the very best of American values." Over the next hour, George and Norma outlined a plan that went far beyond Roberto's original vision for his small repair shop. With federal funding, they could create a comprehensive music center that would not only repair instruments but also provide music education for local children, particularly those from military families. The facility would include a performance space where touring musicians could stop and share their talents with the community, creating a cultural hub that would bring economic benefits to the entire area. "We're also going to make sure that other veterans know about the opportunities you're creating," Norma explained, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had found a project worthy of her considerable organizational skills. "George has connections throughout the music industry, and we're going to use those relationships to make sure your business becomes a destination for musicians from across the country." As the sun began to set over Cedar Creek, Roberto found himself surrounded by blueprints and business plans that transformed his modest dream into something approaching a regional landmark. The conversation had moved from his front porch to his kitchen table, where George and Norma worked with the efficiency of people who had spent decades turning ambitious ideas into successful realities. "There's one more thing," George said, as they prepared to conclude their planning session. "I want to hold a grand opening concert for your new facility. No charge, no special requirements, just a celebration of what America can accomplish when we remember to take care of our veterans." Roberto felt his eyes fill with tears again, overwhelmed by the generosity and respect he was receiving from people who owed him nothing but had chosen to give him everything. "Mr. Strait, Mrs. Strait, I don't know how to thank you for this. You've given me back my future." "Roberto," George replied, standing and extending his hand in a gesture that conveyed respect between equals rather than charity from superior to subordinate, "you gave us your leg in service to this country. Giving you back your future is the least we can do." 3 months later, the Veterans Music Corner and Community Center opened its doors with a celebration that drew visitors from across Texas and beyond. The facility was everything that George and Norma had promised: a state-of-the-art repair shop, a music education center, a performance venue, and a gathering place for veterans and their families. Roberto had hired 4 other disabled veterans as employees, creating jobs that provided both income and purpose for men and women who had struggled to find their place in civilian society. The grand opening concert was unlike anything Cedar Creek had ever experienced. George Strait performed for free, drawing a crowd of over 5,000 people who came not just to hear great music, but to celebrate the transformation of one man's shattered dreams into a beacon of hope for an entire community. Local television stations covered the event, and the story spread across social media with the kind of viral enthusiasm reserved for genuinely inspiring American success stories. During his performance, George invited Roberto onto the stage and told the crowd about the veteran service, his sacrifice, and his determination to build something meaningful for his community. The applause that followed was thunderous, but what moved Roberto most was seeing other disabled veterans in the audience, men and women who now knew that their service mattered and their dreams were still possible. Thomas Brennan had been quietly transferred to another branch of First National Bank, and his replacement, a Navy veteran named Sarah Mitchell, had already approved 3 business loans for local veterans who had been inspired by Roberto's success. The message had been delivered clearly: The community of Cedar Creek would not tolerate disrespect toward those who had served their country. 6 months after the opening, President himself visited the facility during a campaign stop in Texas. Standing in the same shop where Roberto had once feared his dreams were over, the commander-in-chief spoke about the importance of supporting veterans and praised George Strait for using his presidential gift to create something that embodied the best of American values. "This is what America looks like when we remember our promises," the president said, his arm around Roberto's shoulders as cameras captured the moment for history. Roberto Silva gave his leg for our freedom. George and Norma Strait gave their time and resources for his future, and now this community has a treasure that will serve generations of musicians and veterans and families who understand that we're stronger when we take care of each other. As the president's motorcade pulled away from Cedar Creek, Roberto stood in front of his thriving business, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The American flag flew proudly above his shop, and the sound of music lessons drifted through the evening air as children learned to play instruments that Roberto and his team had restored to perfect condition. Mrs. Henderson approached from across the street, carrying the same mandolin that had played the first song in Roberto's original shop before the flood destroyed everything he had built. "Roberto, honey," she said with a smile that carried the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a miracle unfold over months of hard work and community support. "Would you like me to play the first song in your new shop too?" Roberto smiled, feeling the presence of his father and the gratitude of a nation that had finally remembered how to honor its promises. "Yes, ma'am," he said, opening the door to the Veterans Music Corner and Community Center, where the sound of Mrs. Henderson's mandolin would once again christen a space dedicated to the healing power of music and the unbreakable spirit of those who serve. The story of Roberto Silva and George Strait became a symbol of American resilience and compassion, proof that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one person refusing to accept that a veteran's sacrifice doesn't matter, and another person having the courage to prove that it does.